All right, so my name is Damien Burgos, and I'm here with our lovely composer, Miss Gabriela Lena Frank. Miss Frank, it's so wonderful to finally meet you and able to get to know you more.
Well, real pleasure to be here, Damien.
Yeah. So, how did you connect with the University of Pacific? Because I know you're a really great friend with our oboe teacher, Kyle Brookman.
Yeah, Kyle was the first musician that I met when I was a freshman in college, and it was during orientation week. And he and I were assigned to the same dormitory. So I hadn't even stepped foot into the music building where we would both be majors yet. Mm-hmm. And at the time, he had a mohawk out to here, and he was dressed in like faux black leather, and he had combat boots, and he had a broken arm. And so everything was just like scary looking. And I was 17 years old, I was a bit young for a freshman, had just discovered music conservatories even existed a year before, and had a huge change of heart as what I was going to study in school. This was the late 80s when I was finishing high school, and at that time, you know, I was very interested in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was there, Perestroika, Glasnost, the wall had come down, Tiananmen Square happened. I mean, it was just an amazing time of life to have an adolescent political awakening. So it really affected me. And I thought I was going to study political science, and I don't think I would have stayed in academia. I was probably on my way to law school, to be honest. But then I took a summer program to just try to get my college applications a little more attractive, because I had taken piano all my life, discovered a conservatory, and then I met Kyle when I first stepped on campus. So our friendship goes back to when we were teenagers, which is pretty amazing to me now that we're in our 50s. And I think that's the nature of the music world, is that sometimes people go into college as if it's high school number 2. The pandemic really made things weird, there's kind of a almost an urgency to the college years now. But I also think that it's just the nature of music that as soon as you find other nerds like that are into music and creativity, it's very likely you're going to hang on to a lot of these people and grow old with them. So Kyle's not from the Bay Area the way that I am, but he ended up landing in the Bay Area, so that's when our friendship was renewed after we both had graduated more than a decade later after college. And we would hang out. I met his family, became good friends with his wife, and he played a lot of my music all through the Bay Area. So then it was a friendly professional relationship as well. So when he came here, he said, well, I would love to bring you over here. And I've done that the other reverse direction too, because I have a nonprofit academy that I founded in my name, the Gabriela Lena Frank Creative Academy of Music, out where I live now in Mendocino County. I'm not in the Bay Area anymore. And Kyle has been a wonderful mentor to my students who are emerging composers.
Oh, nice. Yeah, so you said that you have familiar with like history with like political science theme to it. I noticed in your website that you also have like a eco-citizenship. Does being part of it like a political science impacted creating that?
Well, I think it's hard to talk about the climate crisis without getting political about it. So I suppose people could, but I don't know how I could. I think that citizens have to vote, and vote, in hopefully in eco-conscious ways. And I think musicians tend to be really idealistic and romantic. We feel like there can be a better life, and we're all, just filled with that kind of desire to make life better. And so it's not hard to convince musicians to become eco-conscious too. So it is a big part of my academy. We have, I think our most important program is something called Composing Earth. It's a 2-year commitment for my composers, in which, done remotely through Zoom, we meet once a month, kind of like a class/book club, and we read books on the economy and science, how it's all tied to systems of racism and capitalism. And then what can we do as musicians? Who are the storytellers that can dialogue and communicate, what's happening So over the first year, we meet every month. We work with a scientist towards the end of the year. Once a week, there's what I call weekly musing, basically a love letter that somebody from the group sends out to the whole group. So you're constantly like in a hug from the group. Like people are going through the journey of it. They're in school, some of them are not in school, so there's a whole range. Some are parents, some are freshmen. So the eco activity can't just be something that I do myself. It has to be done by communities of people if we're really going to change things. And that's another thing that I've always loved about talking with Kyle, is he was always a social justice warrior before we had that term social justice in our vocabulary when we were younger. So I think all these ethics don't form in an artist in a vacuum. They form in discussion with peers. And Kyle, it's not an accident that Kyle and I are peers. He's helped me with the academy. We talk about social justice and the climate crisis. To me, it makes sense how everything just comes together like that.
It definitely brings a deeper relationship between you guys.
That's right. Yeah.
Definitely. So yeah, so as of now, like, how do you like UOP so far?
Oh, well, it's not my first time here. When I finished up my doctorate in Michigan, way back in 2001, my first year out, the school year 2001 to 2002, I lived in Stockton.
Oh, yeah.
Because my roommate was a violin professor here for just 1 year. And it was a cheap way to get closer to the Bay Area, and then I could scout out places there. So I played a faculty recital for her in the recital hall here. I'm also a pianist. And she did a recital on Bartok, Bela Bartok, violin and piano duos of one type or another. And I had always heard about UOP growing up in the Bay Area, that there was this, especially the music school, that there was a fine, small but fine music school inland. Everybody looked to the San Francisco Conservatory or, south towards USC and LA. But there's a good school here too.
Nice. And you have experience working with the chamber group called Trio 180, is that correct? Could you recall that experience of like working with them?
So we have yet to meet in person because it was a pandemic experience. And it was an early one when we were all still shell-shocked.
Right.
And thought this was just going to last first weeks and then just a couple months. So people were learning Zoom and learning to get onto it. Performances were done with masks. No singing. There was no choral concerts. That came later. Anything with the breath was a little more dangerous.
Yeah.
So I will actually meet them in person for the first time today.
Oh, nice.
But they are wonderful players. I mean, even through Zoom, I could just hear their skill level, and I love their bravery in championing new music and music of women, music of Latino women, people of color. I think that's what we need to be doing.
Nice. So, talking about, so I managed to listen to them play the 4 full songs for violin, cello, piano, which we'll perform again later tonight. So it was mentioned on a website and Wise Musical Classical that you drew inspiration from a melodic motives and rhythms of your mother's homeland, Peru. Can you describe the details of those like rhythms and motives?
So that's a great question. Most of my music is not literal. I won't take the literal melody and I won't take the literal harmony. So if it's like 1-4-5-1, I'll do slightly different. I won't take the exact rhythm because it sounds so beautiful already in the original source. And I consider myself part of a diaspora community, daughter of an immigrant. So I didn't grow up in Peru. But we need to show how these rhythms and melodies and all these cultural idioms of other art forms, how they transform in the next generation and how they transform when they cross continents, they cross an ocean. So if you try and make it what it was, there'll always be a pale imitation. So in the trio, and I think Trio 180 is playing just 2 of the movements for tonight. They're not going to play the whole thing.
Okay.
The first movement, I think they're playing Canto para la Maria Angola, which means song for this big church bell that's in one of the big plazas in the old capital, Peru. That was the capital, Cusco, of the Inca Empire. So the bell is not an indigenous object. This is coming over from the conquistadores, from the Spaniards, and they brought over the trappings of their religion. So bells were impressive. And what's interesting to me about this bell, it's huge and it's cracked, but they still will hit it.
Oh yeah.
And so it rings out the sonorities, but then it gets a little distorted. It's not quite right. So in this movement, you have to use your imagination that the piano's going da-da-dum, da-da-dum, as if it's the bell, and the strings are coming out of it. And as they come out, they bend the tone, they harmonize and move with one another, and then it ends. And it's just a big ringing kind of movement. That's a little hard to hear what's going on, just like bells. They just envelop you. So is that a melody, or is it a gesture, or is it painting with sound? And of course, in my imagination, I bend the tones even more. I exaggerate it because I feel like something has to happen for going to through the blender of my imagination. So it's almost like sci-fi, which there are elements of reality, but then this human being has 4 lungs, not 2. And the sci-fi writer does their job well, you believe it.
Yeah.
You're not going to go, that doesn't happen. You get into that world.
Right, that's it.
Yeah. So my job as a musician is not to do things literally, but to exaggerate certain elements for a point, for a dramatic point, and make it surprising, but make it sound new but authentic at the same time. That's what I tell my composers. I said, that's a much more interesting challenge than just translating the rhythm or the melody. The second movement they're doing is one of my mother's favorite things I've ever written. It's short. It's called a serenata. And the violin and cello are going to do nothing but strum through the whole thing. And when they strum, it's the piano that has this melody that's very staccato. Their hands are going around. It's not like a Mozart melody with the classic fingers following one another in passage work. It's something more fluttery. That's almost like the technique that you see at a indigenous guitar. So I'm bringing over a metaphor or a paraphrase of techniques into the piano. And then, of course, I make it more pianistic. So it's not exactly correct. But it's like the piano and the indigenous guitar had a baby.
Oh, yeah.
What kind of music would it make? And I think that the spirit of my being multiracial, being a daughter of an American-born man, but an immigrant woman, being part of the diaspora, it's a wonderfully messy, wonderfully 21st century identity to have. So Trio is short. Trio 180 will be on the stage maybe 6 minutes.
Okay.
But there's a lot packed into those 2 movements each of about 3-4 minutes.
Yeah, so would you say that you coming from a multicultural background, it influenced you to compose these folk songs?
Yes, and that has been the inspiration for my work since I was 18, 19, and now I'm 51. And I didn't realize it, but in school I identified the universe that I would spend my life in. And that's what I have done.
Nice. Oh, and correct me if I'm wrong, you went to Rice University, is that correct?
I went to Rice, yeah, for my undergrad.
And so, did you happen to know Patricia Khanz?
Yeah, we overlap. She was a doctoral student when I was a freshman.
Yeah, she's currently my clarinet teacher.
Oh, of course, when you said clarinet, I should have thought of that. That's right, yeah.
Yeah, it was so nice. Yeah, I remember mentioning it to Dr. Shannon. I was like, oh my gosh, and yeah, she remembers you.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Small world.
Definitely, yeah.
Small world.
And I remember reading about, excuse my pronunciation, Khanz's Recitative Elu D'vorim.
Yeah.
You mentioned that your mother brought some music leaving from Peru to U.S. Would you say that your family members influenced you to want a career path? And I heard that your father's side mostly have like musical backgrounds. Could you give me more details about like overall, like what does your father do as a musician in music background?
So my father's mother was very musical. She had perfect pitch. Her brother was musical. She would have loved to have had a career in music, but she was a young woman during the Depression in 1920s, so all those kinds of opportunities dried up. Now, her type of music was like Gershwin and the sheet music from the 20s and 30s, Irving Berlin, and she had a nice singing voice. And I remember hearing her play and sing at the piano, and then I would sit next to her and just improvise, and we would just play together little songs. So she hoped that my father and my uncle, his younger brother, had the music talent. They totally didn't. So she gave that up. And then my older brother was the first grandkid. He doesn't have it. So she was patient. And then I came along, and she said, she has it, because I was at the piano when I was 2 or 3 years old, making noise and fascinated by it. So it comes down from that side.
Okay.
But the music I was more interested in exploring was from my mom's side. And in part because even though I am mixed race, when people look at me, they see Latina. And that's how I identify as well. I also heard my mother's music growing up in Berkeley in the form of traveling musicians that came through. And I loved that music so much. The different panpipes and the guitars and the percussion. And I saw people that looked like my mother. They didn't look Mexican. They looked indigenous, mixed race. My mom's mixed race as well, Chinese, indigenous. So that was the direction that I went. Now, for the Khanz Recitative, this was a gift to my father. And it's such a short piece, like 3-4 minutes long, and I have this long program note, almost like an essay for it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and because it's an early work, and I was really serious about trying to get into the Jewish forms, even though I didn't really grow up listening to Jewish music. And Jewish music is a very broad term. It's like saying black music or Latin music. What does that even mean? So what my father would have heard in a synagogue when he was still going to that in the 40s and 50s in New York, he would have heard these cantors. And this violin line does take a transcription that I made of a cantor's line, but I play around with it. So even then, before I was very deep into my work that I'm known for, I just have to play around with it and transform it. And in the violin, what makes it virtuoso, even though the melody's simple, it stays on one string. So even when it's climbing up high, it stays on the lowest G string. So you'll see the violin is going way up here instead of transferring over across the bridge to the other strings. They'll climb up high, high, high. And it's a different color. It feels like the cantor, they were tenors, but they pushed their voice. So I love that, not to the point of harming themselves, but there's something so emotional about staying in this area of tension when your diaphragm's going up and your vocal cords are in a certain kind of place.
Oh, yeah.
So that's really the only work I've, just making sure I'm not speaking out of turn. I have one other little joke piece that I did on a kind of a comic style of Jewish music, but this is the only one in my catalog. Yeah.
And on one of your other pieces, Zapatos de Chincha, you said it was, inspired by Chincha. So could you describe the town for those who've never heard of it? Yeah.
So Chincha is a town in the southern coastal part of Peru. It's known for its black and Chinese population. So you have a lot of part black, part Chinese people, multi-race that way, walking around town speaking indigenous languages. So they don't speak Spanish. You hear some Chinese, but the conception of race is just so different when you go to Latin America. And I first discovered Chincha when I was in my mid-20s, I think. I have to go back to my journal to remember the dates that I first went there. And it gave me such a perspective to come back here and look how we deal with race and class and culture here in the U.S. So Chincha is also famous for its cajon, C-A-J-O-N. It looks like Cajun, sort of almost, but with an O, cajon, with an accent mark. And the cajon is a box with a hole cut out in the back, and they just play the box. And it came out of the slave culture in Latin America. There's the Cuban cajon, the Peruvian cajon. I think Brazil has a type of cajon. They all look the same because it doesn't look like an instrument. So the slaves could get away with just like boxes. They're always carrying things around, but they turned that tool, that box, into a beautiful instrument where they get colors out of it. It almost has pitches. Like they can make something sound low if they use the biggest, broadest part of the hand, but then they have their fingers coming up and they go up the sides. So in Zapatos de Chincha, zapatos means shoes. They do a lot of like foot dance with this music.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very. You can find Black Peruvian music is gorgeous music. So this is in homage to that. The cellist, I imagine the cellist at the cajon, and the cellist just pizzicatos the entire time, and it has a bit of a jazzy swing to it.
Okay.
And the violinist is it's like the dancer, dancing around the cajon. And it's short. It also is part of a much larger piece. So it's pulled out of a piece called Ilos, spelled H, silent H.
Oh, yeah.
ILOS, yeah. That CD, Elo CD, we went to the Grammys on it, so I'm very proud
of that. Yeah, I was about to say that.
So it's from a piece called Elo that I think is 7 movements that were written for a great group out in Nashville. They wanted teaching pieces. Not for them, not teaching pieces for players, teaching pieces for an audience that's not used to classical music. They wanted to be able to take short movements in a collection, like in a suite of movements around to the Latin American community or the battered women's shelter, other things. So I mix and match within the quartet of clarinet, cello, piano, and violin. It's the same quartet for the Messiaen quartet in the time. And when I mix and match, this one came out that was violin and cello. I have a clarinet and cello version of it too. And it's not easy for the players, but it's meant to be accessible to the listeners. So it's a teaching piece for new listeners to contemporary music.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned about Hilos, that won in 2012 Grammy Award. So could you reminisce the time?
So like we got a nomination.
A nomination, yeah. Could you, do you recall how do you feel about that during that time? Like,
about going to the Grammys or?
Yeah, something like.
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah. Now I had actually won a Latin Grammy 2 or 3 years earlier. And the funny thing is I didn't go to that ceremony because I was pretty sure I wasn't going to win it. And I watched it from home and I won. And they were saying, where's the composer? No está presente, she's not here. Like this. So I said, I'm going, to the national. I don't care if I win or not. And so all of us, we were so excited to go. And we were, the ceremony is divided into 2 halves. The stuff that gets televised is like the biggest categories. The classical music is not on the show that's televised if you watch it from home. But you can watch from home on your computer the first ceremony, which is for all the smaller categories. The classical music is always in that. And I remember I sat next to Dave Grohl from the Foo Fighters.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, on one side. And then Tony Bennett before he died, right? And the night before, Whitney Houston died. And then Amy Winehouse, so it was like this very emotional ceremony that I remember. And my date was my father. And my dad's a quiet man, but he got a little red vest, So it's one of those kind of lifetime occasions. And the vibe was just so good. Everybody was just happy to be there and congratulating one another. I remember when our picture came up, Dave Grohl was like making the rock fingers at us. He recognized us and it was just a really supportive environment. And then the Grammy show later that night was unbelievable. All the greats came out. There was Bruce Springsteen and Paul McCartney, Bruno Mars. I remember that. Yeah, it was very exciting.
Nice. And between 2022 to 2023, you released your first opera. It's called The Last Dream of Frida Diego, which was premiered in San Diego Opera and San Francisco Opera. Could you describe like your personal experience in making like your first ever opera, Evolva, like what influences you're creating and overall like experience in it?
So yeah, this was a life-changing experience. There was a small opera company back in 2007 when my career was beginning to move. I was in my early to mid-30s. And somebody had, the internet wasn't jumping then, so not really to the point that it is now. So it was a little harder to find emerging composers. And the director of Arizona Opera heard something, and he said, she has an opera in her. I bet she could do this. And the governor of the state of opera at the time loved Frida, so he wanted to do a Frida opera. So I remember he did something very dramatic. He flew over from Arizona just for lunch with me, and I just was like, wow, it must be important, right? And he's got like a member of his staff, and they're coming into the restaurant, and they're like excited to see me as if I'm somebody. So I was like so a little bit intimidated by that, but I was like, wow. And he said, we would really love to commission you to write an opera. And I did have a publisher and manager at this time, so when he asked me, he said, it's not just the music, why don't you write the words? Why don't you write the libretto too?
Oh.
And I said, sure. And my publisher said, sit down. You're not going to ruin your career before it even starts, You're going to find you a real writer. And what I loved about it was they wanted it in Spanish instead of Italian or German or some of the, even English was still a little bit rebellious as an opera language, but had made its way. So Spanish was like, wow, we don't have any huge, really big, widely performed operas in Spanish. There are like lighter zarzuelas and some other sort of musical theater forms.
Yeah.
Then it took 15 years.
Oh.
Because the idea kept popping around. My librettists and I were Latinos, people of color in the opera world. People were afraid of the Spanish language. It was too other. It was hard. But fortunately, in the meantime, my writer and I loved each other. We went on to write 12, 13 other projects, huge ones, including a 45-minute requiem and just a lot of other big things. So we got in shape for the opera. And when it finally looked like it was actually going to happen, I remember my writer and I thinking, wow, this has formed the entire backdrop of our entire friendship. Can we still be friends when it's over? It's kind of like the reel has stopped, or the batteries run out. Of course we have other projects we want to do.
Yeah.
So it was my first opera, and we were taking on Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, who are icons not just in Mexico but around the world. And then my writer decided to not just do like a biopic, which doesn't just work dramatically that well on the stage. But he said, let's do a fantasy. And me and my attitude about what we do with Latin American idioms, you can't just keep it the same. You have to do something to it, to reveal new things. And he said, what we're going to do, because I had written some music about Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, and he had heard it, and he said, this is what we're going to do. In real life, Frida died 3 years before Diego Rivera, after this tempestuous, long relationship where they loved each other and hurt each other, and they were international celebrities. So she's going to be a spirit coming back on the Day of the Dead festival to reminisce with Diego. And this is going to be about, he's about to die and she's going to help him cross over. So they have to revisit. And is she going to help him? She's still mad because for the 3 years that she died, she didn't go back. She stayed in the underworld, still pouting about everything he had done. So thank God it was a hit, because it's so much work to put into an opera. It will consume your life for years. It's a lot of music to write, and everybody has an opinion when it comes to opera. Right. Unlike an orchestra piece or a string quartet where it lands within a small community. Something about the visual and dramatic nature of opera, and when you go into cultural icons. So we sold out more than 90% at San Diego, San Francisco, and then went to LA Opera over the holidays. After Thanksgiving. So it generated a lot of responses, largely positive, but people have opinions.
Right.
Diego is a bad person. He's the villain. No, it's redemptive for Diego. Frida shouldn't have reunited with him. No, she did the right thing to overcome her resistance. And people forget about us. It was like everybody's feelings about it.
Right.
So that tells you something about the power of art.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to do an opera about climate change in some way, you know, and to get people talking about this. But my God, what story? I mean, would it be about the California fires, or how do we, the pandemic, which is actually, as the planet warms up, pandemics are more likely. And we still don't talk about the pandemic as if it was a global symptom of the climate crisis.
Yeah.
But that's what it was. So art can reveal those kinds of things and get people talking. And so I think the opera, it transformed me, but it also told me about the power of artists to get people's conscience going, even if they don't agree. I think what we artists do is very, very important.
Yeah. And the opera about climate change, that could be a really interesting take. So I would encourage, yeah. And I recall in your upcoming projects involving with Concourse Requiem with National Symphony and stage performance at Metropolitan Opera. As of now, how are you feeling about these upcoming events? Because they're the one who will talk about the last dream of Frida and Diego, correct?
Yeah. So the Met Opera did commit to doing Concourse Requiem, but they had to pull out. They ran out of money.
Oh.
The opera companies, I know, it was so disappointing. And we just found out like a month ago. This is new news. Oh. And nothing that anybody did, Met Opera did not fail or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's still recovering from the pandemic. So we hope that they may be able to do it later. So they're not going to do Concourse Requiem. Nashville Symphony is putting out Concourse Requiem on a major CD, on a major label. They'll shop it to the Grammys, and they win a lot of Grammys. So, so that is happening, and I heard them when they performed and recorded it, and it sounds great. And the two singers that sang the lead in front of a 200-voice choir are old friends of mine. So this is another instance of where musicians get each other work, and we work together, and they premiered the work also years ago. So I wrote it for my friends, knowing them this well. The Met Opera will do the Frida Opera.
Okay.
Yeah. They are going to do an entirely new production, new costumes, new sets, a different director. So that's a big commitment. And they have already contracted the director, somebody from Brazil who's a dancer. So she's probably going to have a bunch of dancers that are part of this thing. I think it'll be a really big visual feast. So there are really, good projects coming up. Two others are, I've been composing in residence with the Philadelphia Orchestra for a number of years, and I'm going to be winding that down soon with my last piece that I've written for them. Called Picaflor, Picaflor.
Okay.
Picaflor, which means hummingbird. And the Picaflor is a big figure in Latin American mythology. Sometimes it's part of creation myth, sometimes it's a hero, sometimes it's a Prometheus figure that gets fire. So I'm sort of combining a bunch of myths, making my own sort of mythic meta-myth, using the Picaflor. It will be a large symphony, about 35 minutes, maybe even 40 minutes long. That Philadelphia Orchestra, under Yannick Nézet-Séguin, one of our great conductors right now, will premiere. Oh, actually, wait a second. I think Marin Alsop is premiering that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that will be in the spring of 25. Another project I'm doing is with Drew Lanham. Drew Lanham is a black birder. He's a poet. He's a science professor in South Carolina. He won a MacArthur Genius Grant a couple years ago for his work as a scientist who's also a poet. And when that Central Park incident happened, early in the pandemic with the white woman walking a dog, saying there's a black man threatening her, and he turned out to be this birder.
Yeah.
And he had the whole thing or part of it on the phone, and just another one of these kinds of incidents. That revealed to the country this large community of African American birders, and their passion is nature, which is so touching to me, being part of the Latin community, because Latinos don't go camping. Black people don't really go camping, and there are historical reasons for that, where communities of color have associated the forest with something dangerous, where lynchings have happened, or where the Latinos are brutalized in the agricultural workforce. So Afro outdoors, Latino outdoors, Drew and other people are trying to help us reclaim the environment. We need to be part of the climate crisis movement, to address it. So I'm working with him, and we'll do a set of orchestral songs. He'll write poems for it. I already got the singer for it with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra out of Minnesota. They're probably our best smaller orchestra, chamber-sized orchestra in the country, a really fine group. So many of these projects that are coming up tend to be really high-profile projects at this time in my life. In my conversations with EOP students yesterday, they were saying, how do I get from ear training 101 to that?
Yeah.
And I said, trust me, it's just baby steps. If you were to look at one step to another, you're like, okay, that's doable. I'm just old. I've just been doing this a long time. But I also was like, how do you make the leap? I didn't know anybody in the professional world, not one person in the professional world when I was a freshman.
Yeah.
But you're making those connections, just like with Kyle Buckman. You're making these connections now without even knowing it. Every single person, body by body, person by person that you meet, you are setting up your 30s, your 40s, and your 50s. You really are. So everything you do is super important. I can trace the opera back to, I bet you if I did a lineage chart, I could trace the majority of my project back to freshman year training. I bet I could. Is that direct?
So, if you don't mind me asking, what do you do like outside of your musical career to get to know you personally?
Yeah, well, I left the Bay Area about 10 years ago, and my husband and I, we have about 20 acres of land, 2 properties in Mendocino County, tons of mortgage debt. It's not like we just had a lot of money. We just took a big risk, and we love being homesteaders. I live among redwoods, and we planted about 50 fruit trees, and we grow a lot of our foods. And when the pandemic first happened, we just stepped it up, and we were able to be remarkably self-sufficient. And he hunts birds, so he'll get a couple of wild turkeys, and so that's a big passion of mine. I learned how to make cheese. I became a beekeeper. I have this whole aspect that I really enjoy, and I started doing that when I was living in the Bay Area. I was an urban homesteader, they call us, in Oakland. I had bees and I had chickens, so that's something that's a passion of mine. I like crafty things, so I've been helping my husband with some wood carpentry. My mom was a stained glass artist, so that's something that's enjoyable to me too. I love old movies. You'll always see me, just catching up on the great old movies, samurai movies. It's just like I have all of these like kind of strange niche things I really enjoy. And I remember as I was getting deeper into composing in my late teens and early 20s, because my father was a Mark Twain scholar at UC Berkeley for decades, literature was always in our house. We used to write short stories and essays for him. And I very consciously chose composing to be, as a storyteller, to do it through music rather than as a fiction writer. So that's why when you said that you were in the writing program, I was like, oh, very interesting. I think with the advent of AI, we're going to need our writers even more, those that can outpace AI. I'm not too worried. I was worried when I first saw what AI was doing. I was like, this is so generic. It's so awful. We're okay. We're going to be just fine. Even AI music, I'm like, it's awful,
Yeah.
So if this makes all of us living human beings like work harder to be original and to tap into our life experiences, then maybe it's not such a bad thing. I've had a few things published in different like anthologies, and but not as a writer, more as an opinion piece. I have a column in New York Times that I did a few years ago about what it's like to have hearing loss as a musician. So I'm really interested in making time for that as well.
I would say time's up. Could you give a quick, how can we follow you on social, do you have a social media? How can we follow you?
Yeah, I'm not so active on Facebook anymore, but I'm on there, and I just not long ago signed up for Instagram, so that would be the best place. And I know it's kind of old-fashioned to do a blog, and I have one going on my Academy website, and I might be more active on that too.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your
Yeah,
time.
thank you, Damien.
Definitely looking forward for tonight.
Yeah.